Hi, Bree. Where are we?
We are at Louis Armstrong, A Wonderful World. That's where we're at right now.
What did you think of the show?
I loved it, actually. I'm always a fan for the women in the play, but the four wives, wow, incredible.
It was wonderful. I thought he really looked like Louis Armstrong a little bit. He sang very well.
Tap dancing, I always come for the tap dancing, and I thought it was just going to be Mr. Fleming Jr. this time, but there was a few tappers in the play. Excellent. And Louis, the voice was great, but also the mannerisms.
I love the music, I love the dancing or whatever. I thought maybe there was a little bit missing from the story, but I enjoyed it. She's always so technical.
How many black stars would you give this show out of 5?
Ooh, a 5.
I just liked it all around. For me, I come to plays all the time, so I love coming to plays. And those that I don't like, I get up and leave. So this wasn't one of those. Well, I said it was a 4. I thought that the lead really embodied Louis Armstrong.
I think it was super strong, so I would give 4 out of 5 stars.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Welcome back, Black Stars. I'm Anastasia X, and I love art almost as much as I love Black people, so I started Black Star Reviews to shine a light on the work of Black creatives in New York City and beyond. Today, we are reviewing a new musical on Broadway that is based on the life of jazz pioneer and prolific musician Louis Armstrong. The musical, titled A Wonderful World, opened on November 11th, 2024 at Studio 54. Yes, the one that used to be a nightclub. The book was written by Aurin Squire, the music was composed by Daryl Waters and Branford Marsalis, and the show was directed by Christopher Renshaw. In the lead role of Louis Armstrong is James Monroe Iglehart, who you may know as the genie in the Broadway version of Disney's Aladdin. Thank you to Studio 54 and the press room for tickets. A Wonderful World tells the story of Louis Armstrong's life through the music and the experiences of his not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 wives. There's a lot to like about this show, but there are also some parts that left my head spinning. So, let's get tootin'. We are dedicating this episode to Lil Hardin, wife of Louis Armstrong, and the woman we can thank for accelerating Louis' career during his time in Chicago. In addition to Lil's contribution to Louis' meteoric rise, she had a formidable career of her own. Lil, born in Memphis in 1898, started playing music as a child, messing around with a harmonium organ in the boarding house where she grew up. She studied in the music department for 3 years at Fisk in Nashville before moving to Chicago with her family. And after she got a taste of Chicago, there was no way she was going back to Nashville, and she found work as a sheet music demonstrator until she joined a band, playing in restaurants and cabarets. Eventually, she would meet Louis Armstrong when he joined King Joe Oliver's Creole Band, and the Memphis Music Hall of Fame writes, Lil and Louis grew apart as his fame catapulted in the late 1920s, but it was no secret that her encouragement had made a big difference that the jazz world continues to recognize. After she and Louis grew apart, Lil continued her career as a musician by playing piano on studio recordings, working as a musical director for Decca Records, and writing the song Just for a Thrill, which was popularized by Ray Charles. Lil passed away in 1971, 1 month after Louis. She died of a heart attack while playing the piano at Louis' memorial concert. We are dedicating this episode to Hot Miss Lil and all of the people in our own lives who see and proclaim our greatness before we do. Ashe. The show opens with Louis and a pianist in a darkened jazz bar, and Louis is preparing for his homecoming concert. Between foreboding coughing fits and puffs on his glaucoma medicine, he reminisces about the moments of his life that he wants to include in the show. He speaks dreamily about all 4 wives, joking that it wouldn't be New Orleans jazz if he had stopped at 3. And with that, we're taken back in time to Chapter 1, New Orleans in the 1910s, where Louis is in love with Switchblade Daisy. She's built a reputation as a sex worker with a violent streak. Louis is doing his best finessing to convince her to leave it behind and let him take care of her. He's promising marriage earnestly, and she finally agrees at the worst possible time. After a show with jazz great King Joe Oliver, Joe gives Louis 2 pieces of advice. First, you need a white man, but not a woman. And 2, sharpen your craft by going on the road, or really on the river, with a steady gig on the riverboat. According to Joe, musicians shouldn't be tied down, and he's suggesting abandoning home altogether. So you can hear how following this advice presents a problem for Louis' marriage to Daisy. The problem grows when he's scarred by experiences on the river. Despite all he learns there about musicianship and jazzifying popular music like Avalon, one of his bandmates is lynched by 2 white men for something that he didn't do. The body swings in the wind to Armstrong's Black and Blue. My only sin is my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue? Louis, shaken by the experience, breaks more bad news to Daisy. He's leaving the riverboat, he's leaving New Orleans, and he's leaving her too, for the Windy City. And here begins Chapter 2, Chicago in the 1920s. New decade, new Louis, and new wife. In the Chi, Louis links up again with King Joe, who's got a good thing going and takes Louis on as his second cornet in his band. While Louis's got plenty of musical skill, he's still a dusty Southerner who seems barely cut out for the big city. And Lil, the pianist in charge of arrangements for King Joe's band, tries to dodge his advances while she helps him learn to read music, freshen his outfits, and switch from cornet to trumpet. Like he did with Daisy, Louis wears Lil down, and soon they go together real bad. So bad, in fact, that the 2 of them dip off from King Joe's band and start their own thing. Lil is classically trained, knows her way around the business, and she sees Louis' star power long before he can see it for himself. It burns Louis up when she prints flyers that advertise him as the best trumpet player in the world. He doesn't see how that could possibly be true when elders like King Joe are still living. But Lil responds coolly. It's not a lie. It's a prophecy. At this point, Louis still hasn't followed King Joe's advice to have a white man, but not a woman. But he's lucky that in Lil, he's found somebody who can do both. In an artful recreation of the song that popularized but did not invent scatting, she gets him into a recording studio to cut the track Heebie-Jeebies. She's the pianist and the road manager for the tour. She gets him out of jail time and time again, and things are fine until times get tough. Clubs can't afford big jazz bands, and Louis' solution is to follow the money to Hollywood. When Lil can't convince him otherwise and also refuses to join him, he finds a new, younger wife named Alpha, and the 2 hop a train out west. In Chapter 3, we're in Hollywood in the 1930s, the golden age of the studio system. Louis is a world-class performer, but as a black man, he's still treated as a second-class citizen. When the cameras stop rolling and the lights go out, he worries that his co-stars and directors are laughing at his expense. He wonders if his own people will see him as a coon, and whether the money alone is enough to justify the abuse and subjection. He has an encounter with Stepin Fetchit, who is one of the richest black men in America at the time, has servants to carry his Louis Vuitton luggage, and he's driven around in his new model Cadillac. Fetchit uses Hattie McDaniel and Bojangles as examples to assure Louis that black people understand. They're all in on the fact that the joke is really on white people, and they can relate to just trying to make a buck. The irony of this scene is punctuated by voices of the ensemble calling Louis a sellout and a king. The full-faced smile that he uses as a coat of armor to hide his true feelings doesn't work on black audiences. They feel disrespected watching him grin and bear it. Just as Louis is weighing the decision of leaving Hollywood, the choice becomes a no-brainer. Since the beginning of his career, the mafia have been chasing him to lock him into an unpaid residency at one of their clubs. And since being in movies is not an effective way to lay low, they have caught up with him again. To escape, he finally gets a white man, by hiring Joe Glazer to work as his agent and book him a tour. He takes his wife and his band on the road, but after feeling ignored, Alpha takes his drummer, and Louis is alone again. What's a serial monogamous to do? He can't seem to help that he is the marrying kind. Cue Chapter 4, the final chapter of the show and of Louis' life. New York in the 1940s to the 1970s. In New York, Louis finds his new wife, Lucille, with haste. She's a performer at the Cotton Club, the first dark-skinned woman to have a leading role in the revue, and the two fall in love. Maybe it's because Louis is older, or because he's decided to be done making romantic mistakes. But he's more serious about Lucille than he was about any of his previous wives. Lucille is serious too, and she buys a house in Queens for the two of them, telling Louis that it will be his job to maintain it. Louis casually explains that he doesn't handle his money, his white man Joe does. And when Lucille goes to see about Joe, she finds out that there's another Lucille in Louis' life, the mother of Louis' child. As they're working through that, Louis receives the distinguished invitation to tour globally as a United States ambassador of music. It's a crown fit for Louis' career as a musical king. But the opportunity is quickly rescinded when Louis, watching news coverage of school integration in Little Rock, Arkansas, tells a reporter, "To hell with the people running America." Quicker than you could say, "True," his ambassadorship evaporates. For the next few years, Joe works the phones to find gigs for a now blacklisted Louis, eventually booking him to sing a new Broadway tune, Hello, Dolly. When the song hops over the Beatles to top the charts, Louis finds himself back on top as well, and the show comes full circle to a 1970s Louis planning his homecoming concert in between those coughing fits. When Louis wakes up in the hospital, he seems to be the only one who doesn't understand the severity of his condition. He's committed to ignoring the doctor's advice to stop playing and lead in one last show. But when the curtain closes, he finds himself on the other side. The show finishes with Louis in the great beyond, with all his wives and the ensemble singing What a Wonderful World. Before the election of Barack Obama, my favorite president, and I'm sure this is unlikely to surprise you, was Abraham Lincoln. I didn't even really have to give it that much thought. My ancestors were slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves, therefore Lincoln was my favorite president. I thought it was really unfair that my favorite president was on the penny, the humble penny. It's the only one that's brown, it's not sized according to its value, and it has basically no use on its own. Penny candy is a memory from my parents' time. By the time I was around, the gumball machine wanted 25 cents a pop. Dull pennies, or the ones that had begun to turn green, grossed me out. But a shiny penny had me looking carefully at the relief of Lincoln's face, just that one side. Because I had only ever seen Abraham Lincoln one way, you can imagine how overwhelming it was for me to stand at his feet inside of his monument for the first time. The imposing structure with its sturdy Doric columns made of marble and granite from across the United States felt fitting for someone of Lincoln's stature and sacrifice. Not only did his face now have two sides, but he had a neck, shoulders, and an entire lanky body. His face was serene, but he looked ready for action, ready to get up and walk, crushing Confederate detractors beneath his dress shoes. Penny, no more. Here was Lincoln, the American giant, all 87 feet of him. The projects we make to justify someone's legacy, the documentaries, the biopics, the Broadway musicals, they're all usually intended to have a similar monumental effect. We add color through symbolism, size, context, and dimension, so that modern audiences can fully grasp the weight of what was so revolutionary in the subject's lifetime. A Wonderful World, to me, falls short of creating a larger-than-life monument to Louis Armstrong. Instead, the show keeps him confined to the humble penny, flat, one-sided, small, and polished in so many places that the shine is blinding, and it hides the complexities that would have made him feel real. Mr. Armstrong lived an extraordinary life of 69 years, and because you can't tell it all, what you choose to include becomes that much more telling. The show is billed as the story of Louis Armstrong, told from the perspective of his 4 wives, and all 4 wives are characterized in this musical. But is this the way Daisy, Lil, or Alpha would tell his story? I can imagine Daisy feeling abandoned and like he got what he deserved in the end. I can see Lil feeling like he finally lived up to his potential as the best trumpet player in the world, but also with some sadness that they didn't go all the way together. And while we don't get enough from Alpha to know for sure, maybe she'd feel grateful he rescued her from scrubbing white people's floors, but upset that he replaced her just as quickly as she replaced him. If any one perspective guides this show, it's Lucille's. All of Louis' experiences with his previous wives made him a more emotionally available husband in the end, and she'd say that he has to be forgiven for his mistakes. Lucille is the one who fought to establish his legacy. The house she bought for them still stands as the Louis Armstrong House Museum. Because Lucille's influence extends beyond Chapter 4, I don't think the billing really explains the show's aim. I commend this production on going deeper than a jukebox musical, though. As you can probably tell from the length of the summary, it's not just singing and dancing to Louis' catalog. We get a lot of details about the trajectory of Louis' career. The music and the costumes change with the time periods and the cities, so we also get the historical context of these moments in Louis' life. His trumpet is heard throughout the show, but there's not enough consistent emphasis on his musical abilities for the show to be about Louis Armstrong's musical genius. I hesitate to say this because I realize that it sounds simple, but above all, this show was about the role that race played in Louis' career. And there's not anything wrong with that, except Louis' public identity at the time was intentionally deracialized. In the show, Louis leaves New Orleans after the lynching of his bandmate. That would be enough to spook anybody. When he goes to Hollywood to make movies, he takes roles that leave him wondering if he's the butt of the joke.
I'll be tickling death when you leave this earth, you dog. I took you for my friend. The way you picked me in the back was a sin. You ain't no good, you rascal. Where you going? Look out there. Yeah. Look out there, baby.
When he hires Joe to manage him, Joe tells him frankly, no politics. When, in the final chapter, Louis shares his true feelings about the violence directed at the Little Rock Nine, it's built up as this heroic moment. And it's easy to be jazzed into this version of events, but there are some pieces missing. For one, Louis wrote about his time growing up with the Karnofskys, a Jewish family in New Orleans. He writes fondly of the Karnofskys and describes the discrimination that they experienced from non-Jewish white people at the time. He wore a Star of David necklace for most of his life. For two, Louis is only ever given one opportunity to comment on race in the show, of which he takes advantage and lives through the consequences of being blacklisted for anti-American sentiment. He mentions gruffly how he donated millions over the course of his life to the civil rights movement. For three, the only women prominently featured in the show are his 4 wives, despite Louis having substantial collaborations with women artists at the time like Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday. This matters because surely his experience with the Karnofskys impacted his hopes for a peaceful racial existence. And he could have shared his opinion on race relations at any point in his career. His collaborators often did. Billie Holiday, who worked with him in the 1947 film New Orleans, sang Strange Fruit, one of the best-known protest songs in this country. Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong recorded an entire album together, and she won the President's Award from the NAACP for her work as a civil rights activist when she was still alive.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Nancy and Al. And thank all of you beautiful people, the NAACP, and those that voted. This is such a great honor, such a thrill. I'm so proud to be in class with all of these younger ones coming up. They ain't going to leave me behind. I'm learning how to rap.
But it's not just about what Louis didn't do. or that he was a strong and silent type while others were speaking up. There were times Black people felt that he was actively supporting anti-Black sentiments, and these examples are all courtesy of the Louis Armstrong House Museum. Example 1. Louis had the honor of continuing the Mardi Gras tradition of playing king of the Zulu crew. The Zulus wore grass skirts and threw decorated coconuts while they were rolling through the parade. In the time before Black people were allowed to wear masks publicly, they painted their faces with makeup or darkened them with ash. Those in the know about the long-standing tradition knew that there was no derogatory intent when Louis dressed as King Zulu. But when Time magazine and other publications spread the photos beyond New Orleans, outrage ensued. Armstrong was accused of participating in minstrelsy. Example number 2. Louis recorded When It's Sleepy Time Down South and sang the lyric, "You hear all those banjos ringing, all the darkies all singing." Black people did not find this endearing, and Black newspapers printed photos of Harlemites breaking copies of the record over his use of the D word. Example 3. Louis did not stop his concert in Knoxville, Tennessee when the White Citizens Council set off a stick of dynamite just outside. When interviewed afterward, he said, "Man, the horn don't know anything about it. I'll play anywhere they'll listen." The Baltimore African American printed the following quote: "Even after considering the pro and con arguments on Satchmo Armstrong, we can't shake the feeling that the entertainer who has a real talent doesn't have to use an Uncle Tom grin and carry his hat in his hand in order to sell it. That he doesn't ensure his place in the world by pleasing a few isolated Dixie bigots." That quote sums up a weighty strand of Black sentiment toward Louis at the time, and to me, it seems key in understanding Louis' sense of self. In the Hollywood Step and Fetch It scene, we're presented with Louis' concern that he wouldn't be remembered fairly by Black people, but the context about why Louis would even be concerned in the first place is withheld. In real life, Louis created hours of recordings discussing race relations, discrimination he was facing, and the frustration of being called an Uncle Tom by his own people. He kept scrapbooks of newspaper clippings related to equality, his comments on the subject, and even his peers' responses. He wrote a cover story for Ebony magazine called "Why I Like Dark Women" about all of his brown-skinned wives. Side note, some of the comments that he said about what makes a happy marriage have not aged well. During the Civil Rights Movement, Louis said, "I don't march, but I send my contributions to the Negro organizations. Let the others march. They would only smash my face so that I could not use my trumpet." On a separate occasion, he continued on the same topic. "A trumpet man gets hit in the chops and he's through. If my people don't dig me the way I am, I'm sorry." People close to Louis at the time would have told you that his people did not, in fact, dig him. In a 2006 NPR interview with Joe Marani, a white clarinetist who played in Armstrong's band, Marani recalls, "Most Blacks hated Louis Armstrong. The older ones didn't. The younger ones, no. He was old Uncle Tom, handkerchief head. I talked to Louis Armstrong about this. He was hurt." As for the demographics of the attendees at his funeral, Marani remembers, "At his funeral, when he was laid out on Park Avenue, and I saw quite a few Black faces, I said to him, although he was dead, I said, 'Pops, some of your people showed up.'" I saw Jerrod Carmichael do stand-up the other day at City Winery because he's warming up for a new special coming out soon. I don't think I'm giving away the joke, so I hope Jerrod would not mind me quoting him here. "Black approval feels really, really good, but white approval pays the bills." Louis had white approval in spades, or should I say hearts. But his Black approval in real time was as hard to follow as his trumpet solos. What we know for sure, despite his flippant apologies to those who didn't dig him, is that the times he lacked Black acceptance hurt him deeply. The show doesn't relay this. We see the mafia chase Louis across 3 cities. Even this point was emphasized more than Louis' frustration with his apolitical stance. But so what? What does it matter that we don't get a full understanding of the internal division Louis experienced about protecting his career versus connecting with his people? Why isn't it enough that we get to see a reenactment of the moment he was finally driven to speak up? I will answer those questions with another question. Why weren't we trusted with Louis' full complexity? I can't imagine a profile of Chrisette Michele that shows her fretting over the state of her career without mentioning her performance at Donald Trump's inaugural ball. I can't imagine a documentary of Jay-Z where he discusses the critique that he's a capitalist above all else, and they skip around the part where he ended the Kaepernick-initiated boycott of the NFL by pinning a $25 million deal with the league and Roc Nation to boost the NFL's efforts around social justice. Side note, I've been hyped to see Kendrick Lamar's halftime show since my first listen of GNX, but is this the social justice that Roc Nation is delivering? I would love to hear more about the $375 million in social justice grants that they say have been awarded. Let me say this another way. If 50 years from now, I take my niece to see the Broadway musical they've made about Kanye West, I needed to include Ye's declaration that George Bush doesn't care about Black people. And in Act 2, we need to see him in a MAGA hat talking about how slavery was a choice.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a Black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. George Bush doesn't care about Black people.
But we have Kanye West having a deep conversation with TMZ yesterday where he voices his opinions on slavery. And guys, you have to hear what he has to say before we talk about it. So we have a soundbite for you.
You hear about slavery for 400 years? For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. You was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all? It's like we're mentally in prison.
Goes on to explain why he feels like we are imprisoned, and then later tried to tweet to clarify his point further, saying that Black people have stayed in the position or did stay in the position of slavery for 400 years because they were mentally ingrained to be that way, and that if they had the numbers, they should have spoken out and done something about it. And he says that he won't have his tongue bitten down on, and he won't have his tongue cut out like they did for years. He wants to speak his word.
I want her to see the moments Kanye felt like our cultural treasure, the moments we all turned away from him in embarrassment, and to the extent possible, his internal and private reactions. Anything less would file him down to something thin and uncomplicated, which, having lived in the same timeline as Kanye, is not him. Before I exited the theater, I wrote, "The timing of this show may have been a blessing. I think this show is really here to stay. I think it's a hit. Deeper than a jukebox musical. What is the critique of Louis Armstrong, and was it fully addressed?" I was deciding between 4 and 5 stars. It took me longer than it should have to write this review, and I think it's because the further I got away from this show, the more difficult it was to justify some of the choices that were made. Right afterwards, I felt exhilarated, but 3 days later, I felt a rolling sense of unease. When I started looking into Louis to satisfy my piqued curiosity and to get the facts, it was disorienting to see the gap between the show and the source material. I don't know how many people will leave this performance and go do their own digging, and that's what has me concerned. Without sufficient detail in the critique, we begin to border on propaganda. Louis had a deep desire to be seen as a political figure and a credit to the Black community, but he knew it wasn't going to be a sure thing. What's actually illuminating about any biographic work is not a list of the subject's accomplishments and challenges and relationships, but how they experience those things in real time. What's actually important about Louis's life is not that his own people saw him as a sellout, but how Louis felt about being seen that way. A close look at Mr. Armstrong reveals a hardworking and talented man who was distressed about his legacy. But the shiny veneer of this Broadway production presents him as the character he created for his own protection, flattened, trapped, forever grinning in an always wonderful world. When I set aside my hesitations about the missing parts of the story, I'm able to bestow accolades for the technical aspects, I loved the way they used the rotating set to create movement and take us from a riverboat to a jail cell. The tap choreography by Dewitt Fleming Jr., which I had been waiting to see since his Juneteenth performance on a stoop in Harlem, was to die for. The acoustics were perfect when they danced on the platform, and I only wish that Dewitt's big moment at Step and Fetch It had been danced on that platform as well. For whatever reason, maybe it's where I was sitting, the sound felt muted on the regular stage. And speaking of sounds, the dubbed trumpet felt a little too obvious. It was just ever so slightly off, like when you watch a video with the subtitles in a different language. The emotions matched, but the lip movements do not. While Iglehart may not have had me fooled as a trumpet player, as soon as I heard his Louis Armstrong voice, I was wondering, how long is he going to be able to keep this up? Not only did he nail the rocky aspect of Louis' voice that sounds like he swallowed 3 glasses of gravel, I found his pronunciation of world, and foist first endearing and reminiscent of Louis' recorded speech. It can't be easy to sing and talk in a tone that scrapes your vocal cords down to wispy strings. And his voice instructor, Derek Rosenblatt, admitted, there is no healthy way to do this, but we will do it in the healthiest way possible. Mr. Iglehart is off on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I do hope that he spends those days on vocal rest. I know I haven't said anything about stars yet. In a Black Star first, I am awarding A Wonderful World 3.5 stars. I usually don't do halves. The vocals from Louis and all 4 wives carried this production. When Jennie Harney-Fleming sings A Kiss to Build a Dream On, and Darlesia Kearny sings her half of Cheek to Cheek, I melted directly into the seat. The musical performances and the choreography felt spot on, and the gags sprinkled throughout gave a glimpse of Louis' sense of humor, but the story, which to me is the most important thing, doesn't do enough to render Mr. Armstrong as both accomplished and complex. That said, if I had family coming to town for the holidays, I'd grab a few seats for them to catch the show. One year on Christmas, my family went to the movie theater to see Benjamin Button, and this could be your Benjamin Button. I would especially enjoy having a multi-generational discussion about this show. I imagine that anyone whose life overlapped with Louis might have an account to share on how he was discussed or not discussed in the households of their childhood. And I would love to hear it. Plus, what do the youth know about Louis? Perfect fodder for a family chat. After the show, treat yourself to some red beans and rice, Louis' favorite food. Now, there is a Popeyes in Times Square that I have ducked into more times than I like to admit, because a handful of chicken strips is the perfect snack for an evening subway ride. But I would suggest getting out of the neighborhood, and you're actually going to go home. Because I cannot, in good faith, recommend any restaurant in this city for a solid plate of New Orleans-style red beans and rice. You're going to need to hit the grocery store and whip it up on your own. But if you can settle for just a drink, I'd recommend a bar called Nothing Really Matters on 50th Street. It's not Black owned, but the head mixologist is Black, and they've got a Sazerac on their seasonal cocktail menu. For those that may not be familiar, the Sazerac's history as a cocktail in New Orleans dates way back to 1838. For context, that means that they've been making Sazeracs longer than the slaves been free. Heebie-jeebies. Thank y'all for tuning in to this Black Star review of A Wonderful World, the Louis Armstrong Musical. Thank you to the Louis Armstrong House Museum for all of their wonderfully organized archives on Louis' life, and to Lucille Armstrong, who is the reason the museum exists. It was especially convenient that so much of their collection is available online, and I have to say that I am so grateful for their work. This review was a hard one for me. I wanted to love this show with no hesitations, but I figured I'd take my own critique and document the struggle. Please stay tuned for next week when I'll be visiting the studio of Brooklyn-based artist Will Watson. I cannot wait to share what he's been working on. In the meantime, I am sending you so much Black love and starlight. Stay shining, y'all. Happy holidays.